right, my English teacher friends, Kristian Kuhn coming at you again, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And up my sleeve today for this writing workshop, we have another micro synthesis unit, the ViewMaster edition, and we are going to focus on banning energy drinks. So what's cool about this particular unit is that my students created the prompt, and I'll walk you through that creation. And they also created the source material, and likewise, I'll walk you through that. So without further ado, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It's called Kristian Kuhn, the Bob Ross of composition. Sprinkle a little love on that like thumb and spread the word far and wide to friends, colleagues, and students so that I can beat that pesky algorithm. So all the sources are going to be available for you down below in the description box. So every slide that you're going to see during this presentation is down below, free for the taking. So have at it and have fun with this one. So in terms of creating a prompt, this is what we did. So I ran this unit with my AP Lang students, my 10H students, and my 11 Regent students, because 'tis the season of synthesis. And what we did was, in Google Classroom, I threw a bunch of former exams, whether they be FRQ1s for the AP Lang students, 10H, we have our required course assessments here at my district, and then for Regents, on the New York State exam, we have a synthesis essay, and we studied those former exams for basically pattern. What's indigenous in the pattern? And I helped them wordsmith the prompts, and this is what we came up with for the energy drink one. As the caffeine content of energy drinks has increased, some countries and retailers have banned the sale of these products to children. However, there are no national regulations in the U.S. that ban the sale of high caffeine energy drinks. However, in Senate Hearing 113-331, prominent representatives such as Robert F. Kennedy went on record to state that banning energy drinks for children and teens should occur immediately because they pose a clear and imminent threat to children and teens of existential proportions. And then this last part here is a tag from the FRQ1, the AP Lang exam. And again, you can use whatever your district uses, whether it be a state prompt or an in-house RCA. So this is what we came up with for our AP Langers. Carefully read the following 6 sources, including the introductory information for each source. Write an essay that synthesizes material from at least 3 of the sources and develops your position on whether or not you agree or disagree with Kennedy's assertion. I love the way that this prompt came out, because it reads just like an FRQ1. And had we gone the direction of the New York State exam, we would just throw a different tag on the end right from the exam and plug in the Robert F. Kennedy assertion part. So pretty easy peasy, but students do need a little bit of help with the phrasing of that so that it sets them up to agree, disagree, or qualify, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here. In terms of creating the source material, here's what we have. So I want the sources to fit on one Canvas slide per source, and I have some models and exemplars for that forthcoming. I want a 100-word limit if they're using text. They can use video clips, so you'll see in a second here that my guys used a couple of YouTube videos. I want those clips to be less than 3 minutes long. One of them in this particular stack is 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I was okay with that because it was a really, really good source. I want them to have multiple perspectives, and likewise, they can use graphs, charts, and graphics if they so choose. So I Bob Ross this for my students with a topic of my own. And I went with going gradeless as my topic. So I showed them how to write the essay with that topic. And then when it comes time for them to write, they have to choose a different topic because I don't want them mimicking or stealing my thunder all that much. So they were very well versed on how to do an inverted or a declarative thesis heuristic. And then our body paragraphs, we use the heuristic of the syllogistic method. So they used or based their writing off of my going gradeless paper. So let me show you the sources real quick. So the first one is called The Dangers of Energy Drinks, and it's a chart. And to access it, just use that link right there. And again, down below in the description box, you have Google Slides of everything that you have before you're right here. So you can just cut and paste and click that. Source 2 is a written text entitled Energy Drinks Causing Serious Issues for Teens. Source 3 is a YouTube video, and it says new health concerns about teens and energy drinks. And in this one, it's pretty interesting because they do get into some of the benefits of energy drinks, but it does skew it more towards the negative. Source 4 is likewise a YouTube video, and this is the one that's a little longer. And it has, it's titled Energy Drink Laws Around the World. And this one's pretty fascinating because it talks about whether or not teens can make appropriate decisions on their own. You know, we treat them as little quasi adults. And in some countries across the world, they leave it to the discretion of the parent and the child, which was an interesting thesis that some of my students espoused. Source number 5 is another text entitled Should Teens Be Allowed to Purchase Energy Drinks? And then 6, the benefits of energy drinks. Are there any? That was a hard source to find because most pundits kind of blow the whistle on energy drinks and say, tisk, 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 don't do it, don't drink them, they are bad. But this one actually has that bent on it, which I thought was pretty interesting. So those are the sources, which takes us to the first question that we have, because we have a big blank sheet of paper in front of us. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? I've already hinted at this. We use heuristics in my class, and the first one is the declarative thesis heuristic. If you use this, you begin with the thesis. So you might say something like, Robert F. Kennedy could not be more correct in his assertion. Energy drinks unequivocally all day long should be banned in the United States of America. And voila, you have yourself a thesis statement. It's as simple as that. Agree, disagree, or qualify Kennedy's assertion in the opening line. From there, you got to sprinkle in some context and background. And in a second here, I'll model this for you. And I talk about the GPS, the roadmap, and the compass quite a bit. It's a 4-paragraph essay. So students need to hint at their directionality in the context and background. Where is paragraph 1 going and where is paragraph 2 going? 'Tis an academic paper, so I do want to see a fair amount of tier 2 level words. And what I mean by that are your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. We run an intensive word study academy throughout the whole academic year. So at the stage of recording this, it's the middle of January, and my students have done a good job of augmenting their vocab because it's been a concentrated study of ours, which takes me to the next one, sentence constructs. I also run a nuance academy in which we study Strunk and White, Write It Right. It's a manual, and they espouse the idea that there's 12 sentence types that can be patterned 20 different ways. So in order to achieve voice rhythm and flow, I want to see a variety and some complexity at sentence level, because struggling and emerging writers typically over-rely on the short independent clause, the short declarative sentence. So you get that droning ... type rhythm. And we don't want that. We want to prevent students from doing that. And then introductions are going to be exactly 4 sentences long, no more, no less. You can take that declarative and flip it on its head, and you would call it an inverted And the only difference is the last sentence is going to be where you agree, disagree, or qualify with Kennedy. So you begin with your GPS, your roadmap, your compass, the context, the background. You still want to sprinkle in some tier 2 level vocab. You want to cook those sentence constructs, and it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. That might be a little pie in the sky and a tad bit nebulous. So let's unpack it. All right. So I've hinted at this already. Before students write, they need to know their direction. Where's body paragraph 1 going? Where's body paragraph 2 going? And they're going to hint at that in the introductory paragraph. So here's exemplar number 1. I'll read it top to bottom, and then I'll break it down for you to kind of pinpoint all the hot spots. Whether one wants to admit it or not, the adults of this world have a foremost responsibility to protect their young. But unfortunately, far too many leaders have abdicated their roles and surrendered their parenting rights to the whims of their unsuspecting teens. Clearly, there are far too many teens who are trespassing into dangerous territory and need more support and guidance. Given the emergent death toll among teens, as well as the toll it takes on overall mental health, energy drinks must be banned immediately. So when I grade these, or I'm workshopping with kids, I play a game of I spy with my little eye. I spy with my little eye. Where is the thesis statement? And it's the last sentence. So this one's a straight up inverted. They say energy drinks must be banned immediately. So that situates them in a thesis. In terms of the GPS, they set that in the last sentence as well. So one paragraph is going to be about teen deaths, and then the second paragraph is going to be about the mental health crisis. So this one's done perfectly. They have really good vocab in here. Simple words like foremost, surrendered, unsuspecting, trespassing, territory, toll, like things like that worked really, really well as far as establishing the vocab, the tier 2. The sentence constructs, this is the advice I give. Lay down sentence number 1. Sentence number 2 should stylistically be different than sentence number 1. 3 should be different than 2, and 4 should be different than 3. You don't want any parallelism in here. That's how you create that droning rhythm and that droning tone. So that encapsulates how to do an inverted. So let's paint another one. Again, student needs to know their direction before they begin. Here's number 2. I'll follow the same protocol. I'll read it top to bottom, and then we'll break it down together. Since its release nationwide in 1997, energy drinks have created a young citizenry that is health conscious enough to make informed decisions. Sure, like anything else in this world, kids overindulge and misuse just about anything. But this begs the question, should we in turn ban things like candy, which is the leading cause of cavities, just because a few lack discretion? Clearly, the likes of Robert F. Kennedy of the world are being overly alarmist and dramatic. Energy drinks should not be banned. I spy with my little eye, another inverted thesis. The last sentence gets at the answer to the question. Do you agree, disagree, or qualify with Kennedy? And they're disagreeing with him. And in terms of the directionality, I think it's pretty clear and pretty manifest where the body paragraphs are going to go. This one has sufficient tier 2 level vocabulary. And the one thing I really like to disabuse my students of is this, and you may need to do the same. When you invite a kid to augment their vocab, sometimes it sounds forced and contrived, and students believe the following. If I use $1 million word, somehow I'm doing fantastic writing. And some of your students are going to need to be disabused of that notion. So all of the words in here are bite-sized. They fit the student's mouth. Nothing's forced. Nothing sounds out of place. And it's really, really nicely written. They also do a nice job with the sentence constructs. So you can see in here simple things like the addition of parenthetical statements, the use of the dash in that one sentence bodes well. They even have a colon in there. So that's, you see the manifestation of my Nuance Academy. My students can write sentences like that at ease if they've given me an iota of effort and attention throughout the academic year thus far. Students and teachers, you might be sitting back saying, wow, these kids can write. And they can, right? We've been practicing all year long. My students can definitely write. Yes, you can do it. Just practice, 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 practice. Here's number 3. This is not an all or nothing proposition. So that sounds like a qualifying intro, right? And it's going to invert it as well. Yes, far too many teens are falling into abysmal rabbit holes of making poor life decisions because of their energy drink consumption. So one paragraph needs to go there. But by no stretch of the imagination whatsoever does this necessitate the total banishment of the product from retail shelves. So second paragraph is going there. Instead, safety measures need to be set into place to steer kids in the right direction. So both paragraphs will look at those safety measures. And that is number 3. And again, good vocab, good sentence constructs. And there's nothing really flary about this one. No colons, no dashes. And again, sometimes students think that they need to get into some wonky sentence constructs in order to get that voice rhythm and flow. And sometimes if they overly do the syntax, they overcook it, it sounds a little weird and a little funky. So sometimes less is more. All right, at this stage of the game, pause the video and give it a whirl. Try your hand at writing an intro on your own. Teachers that are watching this, here's what I'm a big believer in. The more writing students see, the better they become. So I would ask a couple of student volunteers or anonymously choose them and project them on your overhead and have students, or you can do it yourself if it's anonymous, explain the directionality of the piece. Because here's what I find. Students, even though I say it repeatedly, will begin to write without knowing their direction. And that's usually where the wheels fall off. If a student knows their direction, following the kind of constraints and restraints of the heuristic is relatively easy. So here's one more student example, and I'll read it top to bottom, and you can get a sense of it. It seems to be that the likes of the Robert F. Kennedys of this world are the only sensible adults willing to step to the plate for teens. Not only is there a mental health crisis raging among our youth, so that's body paragraph number 1, which can be solely traced to these products, but we have a nation of kids making entirely careless and dangerous decisions that have led to far too many deaths. Paragraph number 2. Something needs to happen and happen sooner than later. Unquestionably, banning energy drinks is a step in the right direction. So you're going to see here that my students did more inverted than declarative. And I found that my students that are able to wield the heuristic and are pretty competent in their writing, by and large, inverted. And that was one of the blessings of Bob Rossing my instruction. In my exemplars, I tended to invert as well. I just found that my reader, my audience needed a little bit of context and background before I clobbered them over the head with a thesis statement. So you might want to talk about, why would you declare and why would you invert? Struggling and emerging writers have an easier time declaring, but I find that for the most part, they're not as skillful as the kids that went the inverted route, but I'll leave that to your discretion. So intros are done. We still have a lot of white space left, so we need to ask ourselves the question, so how do I write the body paragraphs? Earlier in the presentation, I alluded to the syllogistic method. This is the heuristic that we're going to use for the purposes of pegging down our body paragraphs. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle thunked it up. And it's kind of a quasi-mathematical formula to ensure that the line of reasoning stays intact. So Aristotle said that logic has this mathematical quality to it. And he created this formula where you go premise 1, premise 2 to the conclusion. So if I say to you, arsenic is deadly in premise number 1, you're all going to nod your head and say, yep, Kristian, you are right. And then imagine I'm writing an essay. I got to give you my textual support in the second premise. So I say, all right, guys, I walked into the kitchen this morning to make a cup of coffee, and there's Snickers beneath the kitchen sink. I say, Snickers, what are you doing? And he pulls his head out, and he's got white stuff all over his muzzle and grizzle. Here's the thing. I got a rat infestation in my house. You are immediately going to gasp and say, oh no, Kristian, your dog's going to die. Morbid example, but it gets kids' attention. And that is what a syllogism is. It's a package of logic, right? It's a package of reasoning that sustains a cogent line of reasoning. So how do we morph that into a heuristic for the purposes of writing synthesis paper? The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. Up top in the thesis, we just agreed, disagreed, or qualified with Kennedy. Now we're getting into the why reason, and we got to tie it back to the directionality, to the GPS. Whatever you first hinted at in the introduction is going to be your why reason for the first premise. There is a fair amount of mathematics in my heuristic, and the first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. So you might want to write that down. First premise is going to be 3 sentences long. Here's the reason why. On most state exams and RCAs and even FRQ1 for the AP Lang exam, they say something like this, either exactly this or something closely akin to it. Your argument must be central. To keep the centrality of the argument, we got to keep the source material out of this. It's just the student's argument. So don't mention the sources, don't quote, don't paraphrase, don't even hint at the sources yet. We want nothing but the student's argument for those first 3 sentences. In the 4th sentence is where you begin the second premise, and this is where you insert the support and the analysis, where you're going to quote and paraphrase. I'm going to model this all for you in just a second. And then you also got to remember that body paragraphs need conclusions. So you don't just tag a conclusion on the end of the essay. Your paragraphs need to be concluded. And this is where we link it all back to the thesis and the prompt and make sure that we keep the promise of the first premise. So last bit of math. A syllogistic body paragraph is going to be 10 to 12 sentences long. We are only writing 4 paragraphs. And I find when students are writing, pithy body paragraphs of 10 to 12 sentences, they don't need that 5th paragraph because they haven't written those, small baggers of 4 or 5 sentence body paragraphs. I think if kids are being that brief in their bodies, that they are precluding themselves from developing the support and analysis necessary to rip a really well fleshed out argument. So let's break this down bit by bit and ask ourselves the question, how do I write a first premise? For your students that are writing this for the first time, it might be a good idea to give them some stems. And I have 2. There is a clear reason as to why if they are going singular, and there are a couple of reasons why if they are going plural. If a student states reason why in the first premise, by default, linguistically, they will articulate a reason why. So this is a hard concept to teach without this training wheel. And for the first crack at it, you might want to ensure that students at least are articulating a reason why. So here are 3 sentences that equal up the first premise using the stem. There's one principal reason as to why energy drinks should not be banned. It is only a problem for a select few demographics. Instead of safeguarding every citizen from something that only harms a few, simple measures can be taken. A first sensible step requiring an age limit, such as 21 years of age, is prudent. So when I'm writing workshopping with students or I'm grading, I sit back and say, what's the promise of the first premise? And this one's really clearly articulated. I like this one. Basically, we're going to say that safety measures need to be in place, such as an age requirement or an age stipulation, that energy drinks like vaping, like alcohol, like cigarettes, need to be at the age of 21. So at 21, kids can purchase these, but any younger than that, they cannot. So let's recap that real quick. What is a first premise? You need 3 sentences and you got to argue a why reason. And when you're done with that, you got to ask yourself this: what's the promise of the first premise? And that will dictate the quotes and paraphrases that a student selects. So let's see a couple of more first premises just to unpack it. And I'll take the stem away on this next one. Unfortunately, teenagers are like lemmings and will blindly conform to whatever the current trend might be. Whether it be a piece of clothing apparel, the latest TikTok trend, or drinking dangerous amounts of caffeine, far too many kids lack the wherewithal to exercise restraint and rational thinking when making critical decisions. As such, one must take a good look at the pros and cons of banning energy drinks. Promise of the first premise: what is it? What is it? What is it? Right? Again, it's got to be manifestly clear. And in this one, it is. So we're going to take a look at the pros and cons of banning energy drinks, but in particular, the fact that perhaps those frontal lobes just aren't developed enough for kids to make the right decisions. So again, that basically sets up what quotes and paraphrases the student must choose and the direction that they're going to go as far as that GPS is in terms of establishing a line of reasoning. Let's see it one more time without the stem, and then I'll show you the whole rest of the body paragraph. Safety measures such as age restrictions are already in place for things such as vapes, cigarettes, and alcohol. Energy drinks should be the next product to follow suit. So what's the promise of the first premise? Have age restrictions, age stipulations. Not only do regulatory measures need to be put into place to address our nation's teenage mental health crisis, so we need quotes and paraphrases for that, but we have seen one too many deaths as the result of these products. So we got to talk about mental health and we got to talk about death, and then the prospect of introducing that age requirement as well. So when the student is done with that first premise, they got to go quote hunting and make sure that they have quotes and paraphrases that align and jive with everything that is stipulated in that first premise. And that sets them up for the support and analysis of the second premise, right? So let's jump to the second premise. So this is the 4th sentence of the syllogism. I tell my students to get quoting immediately in the 4th sentence. And before I do that, I want to talk to you about something that I have called the 5-word rule, one more piece of math. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. So I'll walk you through this second premise and take you through how we use that 5-word rule, as well as get the sources talking to each other and how to transition into and out of quotes. Okay, so let's work through our way this entire second premise. So second premise begins at the 4th sentence, and ordinarily I tell my students get quoting in the 4th sentence because you've kept the centrality of your argument in the first 3 sentences. You don't mention any quotes, you don't mention any paraphrases, don't mention any sources. So instead of dragging that on any longer, 4th sentence, I start quoting. So it's going to look like this. In a recent interview with Sky News Network, Lilith Smith asserts that current energy drinks on the market are an existential threat to the safety and well-being of teens, given the pull that underdeveloped frontal lobes have toward caffeine, an effervescent and addictive drug compound found in most energy drinks. Let's talk about that quote and how that is set up. So my students use a heuristic within the heuristic known as the 5-word rule. If you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep your quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. But you can see in there that this student is bracketing, right? Because you need some context for it to make it conversational. And then they also added a parenthetical. That stuff needs to be taught and modeled extensively. And I've Bob Ross that from day one with our synthesis units. So when we quote, we have to analyze. Look at the transition here. Within this line of thinking, what line of thinking? What we just quoted. So transitions like that are also important to teach. So within this line of thinking rests one simple truth. Being a teenager is tough going should the adults of the world decide to abdicate their responsibilities. Unfortunately, and perhaps one can chalk it up to a lack of experience or immaturity, but far too many teens that lack the cognitive capacities to discern right from wrong when confronted with the allure of succumbing to addictive toxins, source 5. And yet again, that uses the 5-word rule. So let's add some more math to this. Synthesis is a pluralistic word. It necessitates more than one. Quoting twice is a bare minimum, right? Because that's plural. 2. I often tell my guys, quote at least 3 times in a syllogistic body paragraph. I'm out of space here, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. And again, when you quote, you have to analyze. Take as a clear case in point, Ben Wyeth. Back in the autumn of 2024, a trend emerged which saw teenagers guzzling 3 Red Bulls before heading off to school in the morning. In brief, this caused Ben's heart to arrest and set his nervous system into shock. James Cook, a sophomore in rural Illinois, followed the trend, which witnessed his death as well. Source 3. So that's a total of 3 sources. So you got a blend of paraphrase and you got a blend of direct quotes. I think that's a good balance to have for kids instead of quote, 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 quote. Maybe do 2 quotes, 1 paraphrase, and proceed that way. So we paraphrase, we dropped a source, we have to analyze it. That's the key. Whenever you source drop, you got to analyze the source. And that usually takes 1, 2, or 3 sentences. Whether it be trends like this or casual consumption, far too many teenagers lack the discernment to make the best choices. So we got plenty of source material in here, but we have to conclude the thought. We're not done yet. We got to bring it all the way back to the prompt and all the way back to the thesis. So a simple 2-sentence wraparound is all that's needed for the conclusion. And again, this is all in one body paragraph. These are not separate parts, right? You're not dividing the paragraph here. Clearly, the adults in these kids' world need to do more to protect them. As such, Robert F. Kennedy is correct in the following assertion. Energy drinks must be banned for the good of all. So you can see there, it went all the way back to the prompt, all the way back to the thesis, which is what you want to do in the end there. So intro's done. One body paragraph is done. We got to ask ourselves the question, what do I do next? Bam! Bust out another syllogism. As I've alluded to, it's going to be a 4-paragraph essay. So in the second body paragraph, I like that area to be set aside for some rebuttals, concessions, some rhetorical maneuvers such as that. And when you do that, you can transition like this. But. So beginning that 3rd paragraph with but sets them up for a concession. But there's also a differing perspective on the issue that must be acknowledged and addressed. One can easily concede to the fact that there is a teenage mental health crisis. So all the quotes and paraphrases now need to be tied to mental health, right? But look at the but again, look at the conjunction. But one must also note that energy drinks have benefited a lot of youth, both physically and academically, right? So we got to get information about that. This is not an all or nothing proposition, but there are unquestionably more elements of good than bad. So this student is going to argue that energy drinks have many positive qualities and aspects to them. So teachers that are following along, this is a good spot where you can use that first premise and then have your kids practice going quote hunting, getting the second premise. So ask them to pause here, get into the sources, and find 3 instances in which energy drinks actually have positive qualities. Like, you're going to focus on some of the negatives because you're offering that concession, because as the first premise states, it's not an all or nothing proposition. And then maybe you want your kids to go one step further and actually write the whole rest of that syllogism, and maybe you can Bob Ross it and show them how to do it. So it's time to wrap the essay up. We have intro, first body, second body done. In terms of wrapping things up, I like to use conclusion stems early in the academic year. And I always tell my students this with regard to the conclusion paragraph. It's kind of like the grand finale of a fireworks display, the all-encompassing, all-encapsulating exigent statements. So stems like simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day, bode really well to set kids up to hammer home the big idea. So if we see that fleshed out, again, you're going to take about 3 or 4 sentences. You don't want to prattle on and on and on, and just get back to the thesis, back to the prompt. In no other words, we need more Robert F. Kennedys of the world stepping up to the plate for teenagers. Not only are we under assault by the likes of energy drinks, but we are pleading for help. Adults need to do what they are here for, adult and lead the young back to safety. So just take it away in 3 sentences there. That's all you need. And you're perfectly perfect. So that brings us to the end of an entire essay. Happy writing, happy teaching. Note that if you need to reach out to me for anything, you can drop me an email at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. I always respond to emails, and I love the collaborative nature that my YouTube channel has created and fostered. I got teachers talking to teachers, teachers lesson planning with teachers. So I always like to connect teachers and even students. So feel free to drop me a line. I will respond. I also offer a lot of professional development throughout the calendar year. I travel to districts and I train departments. I train individual teachers. I train teams. So if you would like me to come to your school, I'm more than happy to do that. We also can meet in Zoom if distance is an issue. I also have a tremendous self-paced course that goes over everything that I do in the classroom, from Word Study Academy, Nuance Academy, my sentence patterning, and then all the expository modes. So if you're teaching AP Lang, there's plenty of stuff for you. AP Lit, tons of stuff for you. If you're general ed, tons of stuff for you in that self-paced course. If you want more information on that, you can check out my website at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. And upon exploring that, if you have any questions, as always, drop me an email. That's it for microsynthesis. And in the channel, you got one on TikTok and you got one on the GOAT debate. So plenty of fodder there for you to tussle with, and you could actually give your students some choice depending on their interest. I'll continue to produce some more in the coming weeks and months, so sit tight for that, and thanks for joining me.